January 1944. Somewhere in the Reich, inside a low concrete signals intelligence building, the air is stale with cigarette smoke and hot machinery. Typewriters sit idle. Paper tape curls across wooden desks. A radio receiver hums softly, pulling voices out of the dark Atlantic air. German intercept operators listen carefully. Another American transmission arrives. It is long, methodical, perfectly structured. Columns of letters are copied by hand, frequencies noted, timestamps recorded. Everything is done correctly, by the book. The message is passed down the line to cryptanalysts who have broken some of the most complex codes in Europe, men who unraveled Enigma, men who have watched entire Allied convoys vanish because of words decoded in rooms like this. But this time, the symbols refuse to bend. No repeated patterns, no exploitable rhythm, no mathematical weakness. Hours pass, then days, then weeks. The Americans are sending orders, strategic orders, across oceans and battlefields, and the German intelligence system, so confident in its mastery of cipher warfare, is blind to them. By 1944, German officers begin to understand something unsettling. The enemy has learned from their mistakes, and somewhere inside the U.S. Army Signal Corps, a machine called SIGABA is quietly winning a war without firing a single shot. The story of how that happened begins years earlier, in a world already convinced that no code was truly unbreakable.
By the time the Second World War erupted in September 1939, warfare had already changed in ways most soldiers would never see. Battles were no longer decided only by artillery, armor, or air power. They were decided in silence, in signals rooms, in basements, in hidden facilities where the war was fought with paper, mathematics, and electricity. Every major power entered the conflict convinced that secure communication meant survival. Germany believed this more than most. The lessons of the First World War were still fresh. Intercepted radio traffic had exposed troop movements and operational plans. This time, the Reich would not repeat those mistakes. By the late 1920s, German engineers had refined mechanical cipher machines into tools of remarkable complexity. The most famous of these was the Enigma machine. Enigma was not just a single device, but a family of machines. It used a system of rotating rotors, electrical wiring, and daily changing settings to scramble plain text into unreadable cipher. Each keystroke altered the internal wiring path. With 3, then 4 rotors, plug boards, and daily key sheets, the number of possible combinations reached astronomical levels. To German commanders, it appeared mathematically invincible. And for a time, it was. German operational success in the early war years owed much to this confidence. U-boat commanders coordinated attacks across the Atlantic. Panzer units maneuvered with speed and precision. Luftwaffe squadrons received real-time orders. All of it traveled through encrypted radio transmissions that German leaders believed no enemy could read. But Germany was not alone in the cryptographic race. Britain, having learned harsh lessons during the First World War, invested heavily in signals intelligence. At Bletchley Park, a quiet estate north of London, mathematicians, linguists, engineers, and chess champions were assembled into an unprecedented intelligence effort. Their goal was simple in theory and monumental in practice: break the enemy's codes faster than the enemy could change them. By 1940, the impossible began to happen. Through captured materials, operator errors, and relentless mathematical efforts, British cryptanalysts began reading portions of German Enigma traffic. The intelligence derived from this work, later codenamed Ultra, gave the Allies a window into German intentions at every level of war. Convoys were rerouted, ambushes were avoided, battles were quietly shaped before they were fought. Germany, meanwhile, remained largely unaware. The Reich's confidence in its cipher systems bred complacency. Though improvements were made, additional rotors, stricter procedures, the fundamental belief remained: Enigma was secure. When intelligence failures occurred, they were blamed on spies, chance, or bad luck, rarely on cryptographic compromise. Other Axis powers followed similar paths. Japan relied on complex manual and machine-based systems. Italy employed ciphers that were often less robust, sometimes disastrously so. In each case, Allied cryptanalysis achieved varying degrees of success. By the early 1940s, one pattern was becoming clear. Every cipher system, no matter how complex, contained weaknesses: mechanical limitations, human errors, predictable procedures, repetition, overconfidence. And nowhere was this belief stronger than within the German intelligence community. By 1941, Germany had reason to feel superior. British and Soviet codes had been broken. Allied diplomatic traffic was often readable. Even American communications, before the United States formally entered the war, showed signs of vulnerability. The German Signals Intelligence Service, B-Dienst, had enjoyed notable successes in the Atlantic, particularly against poorly protected convoy traffic. To German officers, the intelligence war appeared one-sided. The Americans in particular were underestimated, viewed as industrially powerful but strategically inexperienced. The United States was not initially regarded as a cryptographic threat. Early American cipher systems reinforced this perception. Some relied on codebooks or relatively simple mechanical devices. Others suffered from procedural weaknesses that made long-term security questionable. This assessment would soon prove dangerously wrong, because while German cryptanalysts focused on refining their own systems and exploiting enemy weaknesses, a quiet revolution was already underway across the Atlantic, a revolution born not from confidence, but from fear. Fear of interception, fear of compromise, fear of repeating the mistakes Germany itself was making. And as the global cryptographic battlefield hardened, the United States began preparing a machine designed not to win quickly, but to endure unbroken. To understand how that machine came into existence and why it would confound German intelligence, the focus now shifts to America's entry into the war and the transformation of its approach to secrecy.
When the United States entered the Second World War in December 1941, it did so with vast industrial potential but uneven military preparation. Nowhere was this imbalance more apparent than in the realm of secure communications. The U.S. Armed Forces understood weapons, logistics, and production. Cryptography, however, was still a field in transition. Before the war, American military communications relied on a mix of codebooks, manual ciphers, and early mechanical machines. Some were effective for short-term use, others were vulnerable if captured or reused too often. American cryptographers were aware of these limitations. So were their adversaries. German and Japanese intelligence services had already identified weaknesses in certain U.S. diplomatic and naval systems during the late 1930s. The problem was not ignorance, it was scale. Modern war demanded constant communication across oceans and continents. Orders could no longer be hand-delivered or delayed. Radio was essential, but radio was also visible to anyone listening. Every transmission was a risk. Inside the U.S. Signal Corps, a small group of officers and civilian cryptologists began asking a dangerous question. What if the enemy was already listening and already learning? One of the most influential figures in this effort was William F. Friedman, a civilian cryptologist whose experience stretched back to the First World War. Friedman had studied foreign cipher machines. He understood their strengths. More importantly, he understood their flaws. Machines like Enigma relied on predictable rotor stepping, limited internal wiring complexity, and operator discipline. Break the procedure or exploit the mathematics, and the system collapsed. Friedman believed the next generation of American encryption needed to eliminate these weaknesses entirely. The result was a project so secret that few outside the Signal Corps even knew it existed. Its early designation was ECM Mark II. Its operational name would later become SIGABA. SIGABA was not built for speed or convenience, it was built for security. Unlike most cipher machines of the era, SIGABA used not one but multiple sets of rotors. One set encrypted the message itself, another set controlled how the encryption rotors moved, a third set introduced irregularity, unpredictable changes that eliminated repeating patterns entirely. This was the critical difference. In Enigma, rotor movement followed a largely predictable mechanical sequence. That predictability, however slight, gave cryptanalysts a foothold. SIGABA removed that foothold completely. Its encryption rotors stepped in an irregular pattern determined by an independent control mechanism. The result was ciphertext with no exploitable periodicity. From a cryptoanalytic perspective, this was devastating. There were no fixed cycles, no repeated keys, no statistical anchors. Even if a German analyst knew the internal wiring of the machine, a scenario already unlikely, there was no reliable way to predict rotor movement. The mathematical complexity exceeded anything in operational use at the time. And the Americans were cautious. SIGABA machines were reserved for high-level traffic, strategic commands, theater-level coordination, communications between Washington and overseas commanders. Strict operating procedures were enforced. Keys were changed frequently. Operators were trained to avoid predictable phrasing. The machine was heavy, expensive, and difficult to maintain, but those flaws were acceptable. Security was the priority. By 1942, SIGABA was an operational service across multiple theaters of war. In Europe, the Pacific, and North Africa, American commanders began transmitting orders with a confidence they had never known before. Entire campaigns were coordinated through messages that could be intercepted but not understood. German intelligence noticed immediately. Interception stations logged increasing volumes of American traffic. The signals were strong, the formatting was professional, everything about them suggested importance, yet attempts to analyze the cipher produced nothing, no progress, no breakthroughs. At first, German analysts assumed time would reveal weaknesses. All machines failed eventually. All systems contained errors. History had proven this again and again. But as months passed, the silence remained unbroken. The American messages were not just unreadable, they were structureless, a nightmare for any cryptoanalyst trained to find order in chaos. Reports began circulating within German intelligence units. The Americans were using a new machine, a very different machine, one whose internal logic resisted every known method of attack. By late 1943, the implications were becoming impossible to ignore. For the first time in the war, Germany was facing an enemy whose strategic communications were completely opaque. No leaks, no lucky breaks, no mathematical shortcuts. Only silence. And that silence would soon shape the war's most critical decisions, whether Germany understood them or not. To grasp the full impact of SIGABA, the story now turns to the war seen from multiple perspectives: those who built it, those who used it, and those who desperately tried to break it.
Behind every cipher machine stood people, not abstractions, not equations, men and women working long hours under pressure, aware that a single mistake could cost lives. On the American side, SIGABA operators were selected carefully. They were trained not only to operate the machine, but to respect it. Procedures were rigid, keys were protected, machines were guarded. Operators were instructed to assume that every transmission was being intercepted, even if it was never read. This mindset mattered. American cryptographic discipline, shaped by early vulnerability and hard-earned caution, became a silent strength. Messages were composed with care. Predictable language was avoided. Even routine orders were structured to deny patterns. SIGABA was not treated as invincible, but as something that required constant respect. On the German side, the human experience was very different. Intercept operators did their jobs efficiently. Messages were logged, categorized, and forwarded to analysis units, but cryptanalysts faced a growing psychological strain. They were trained to believe that persistence always paid off, that every cipher, given time and effort, would eventually yield. SIGABA
did not. Weeks of work produced nothing. Months yielded only frustration. Analysts could not even begin meaningful statistical analysis. There were no repeated sequences to anchor hypotheses, no recognizable distortions of language. The silence was unsettling. For cryptanalysts accustomed to progress, however slow, this was a professional shock. Reports reflected caution at first, then uncertainty, eventually concern. SIGABA was not just another cipher, it behaved unlike anything they had encountered, and that realization cut deep. At its core, SIGABA represented a philosophical break from European cipher design. Most Axis machines prioritized mechanical efficiency. They relied on a limited number of rotors and predictable stepping patterns to balance security with usability. SIGABA rejected that balance. It embraced complexity without compromise. The machine employed 15 rotors in total, divided into functional groups. The encryption rotors transformed plain text into ciphertext. The control rotors determined how those encryption rotors moved. Additional components ensured that movement was irregular and non-repeating. This meant that even identical plain text inputs sent under similar conditions produced entirely different outputs. To a cryptanalyst, this was devastating. Traditional attacks relied on frequency analysis, known plaintext, and mathematical modeling of rotor behavior. SIGABA denied all three. Without predictable rotor stepping, there was no reliable way to reconstruct internal states. Even large volumes of intercepted traffic provided no foothold. German intelligence understood machinery. They had built some of the finest cipher devices in the world. But SIGABA was not simply more complex, it was conceptually alien. Breaking it would have required resources, time, and insights that Germany simply did not possess during wartime. SIGABA was not a laboratory curiosity. It was used in real operations under real conditions across multiple fronts. In Europe, it carried messages coordinating the buildup of American forces in Britain. In North Africa, it transmitted operational orders during fluid desert campaigns. In the Pacific, it linked commanders across vast distances where radio was the only option. These were not trivial communications. They involved troop movements, supply priorities, strategic intent, decisions that shaped entire campaigns. German intelligence intercepted many of these messages. They knew they were important. They could see traffic volume increase before major Allied actions, but they could not see inside the messages themselves. This created a peculiar imbalance. Germany could sense the weight of American planning, but not its direction. They could feel pressure building without understanding where it would fall. SIGABA did not win battles by itself, but it allowed American commanders to plan with confidence, to coordinate without fear, to act without revealing their intentions. And as the war intensified, that advantage grew more powerful with every unread message. The remaining angles, how German intelligence reacted, how Allied leadership trusted the system, and what this meant strategically, now come into focus.
Within the German intelligence structure, intercepted American traffic triggered an uncomfortable paradox. Signals units could hear everything, but understand nothing. The Reich had built an extensive interception network. Listening posts stretched from occupied France to Scandinavia, from the Balkans to the Atlantic coast. American transmissions were logged meticulously. Frequencies, call signs, transmission habits, these were all analyzed in detail, but cryptanalysis stalled at the first step. German reports described American high-level cipher traffic as structurally resistant, a carefully chosen phrase. It meant that the ciphertext did not behave like language at all. There were no repetitions that suggested rotor cycles, no anomalies that hinted at operator error. Even large volumes of traffic failed to produce meaningful patterns. This was deeply unsettling. German cryptanalysts were not ignorant. They understood what they were seeing, and more importantly, what they were not seeing. The absence of weakness was itself a signal. It suggested a system designed by someone who understood cryptanalysis from the inside. By 1943, SIGABA traffic was effectively categorized as unreadable. not temporarily, not pending further work, unreadable in principle. This was a rare admission. In intelligence culture, declaring something unbreakable bordered on heresy, yet that is precisely what some internal assessments implied. Resources were gradually redirected, effort was reduced, attention shifted elsewhere. The Americans, for once, had built something Germany could not penetrate. Security is only useful if leaders trust it. American commanders, from Washington to forward headquarters, relied on SIGABA with growing confidence. Strategic planning required speed and secrecy. SIGABA allowed both. Orders could be transmitted rapidly without the elaborate precautions that slowed other systems. This trust was not blind. The U.S. Army Signal Corps enforced strict control. Machines were inventoried. Loss protocols were clear. In the event of capture risk, machines were to be destroyed, no exceptions. But within those safeguards, SIGABA became a backbone of Allied coordination. It enabled joint operations, multinational planning, complex logistics across thousands of miles. Contrast this with German leadership. German commanders trusted Enigma absolutely, too absolutely. They dismissed early warnings, they ignored anomalies. Even when evidence mounted that Allied forces knew too much, the possibility of cryptographic compromise was rarely accepted. The Americans had learned the opposite lesson. SIGABA was secure not because it was assumed to be, but because it was treated as if it might fail at any moment. There is a moral dimension to secrecy in war. Cryptography is not just about hiding words, it is about protecting decisions that send men into danger. SIGABA's security meant fewer compromised operations, fewer ambushes, fewer catastrophes born of leaked intent. It did not make war humane, but it reduced avoidable loss. For German intelligence officers, this created a growing strategic blind spot. They could estimate American strength, they could track industrial output, they could observe troop concentrations, but they could not hear intent. That absence mattered. Wars are often decided not by what is seen, but by what is understood too late. By denying Germany insight into American strategic thinking, SIGABA shifted the balance subtly but decisively. It removed one of the Reich's most powerful tools, foreknowledge. And as the war moved towards its most critical phase, that silence would matter more than ever, because there would come a moment when Germany realized beyond doubt that the American cipher system standing in their way would not yield, and that realization marked a turning point in the hidden war beneath the visible one.
By early 1944, the war had entered its decisive phase. The Axis powers were under relentless pressure on multiple fronts. In the east, the Red Army was advancing with overwhelming force. In the south, Allied troops pushed up the Italian peninsula. And in the west, something immense was gathering just beyond the English Channel. German intelligence could sense it. Radio traffic increased, not only in volume, but in discipline. American transmissions flowed steadily between Washington, London, North Africa, and newly established headquarters in Britain. Call signs changed, frequencies rotated, message lengths grew longer. The structure suggested coordination on a massive scale. For German analysts, this was familiar territory. Before major operations, patterns usually emerged. Preparations created noise, traffic surged, then narrowed. With enough intercepted material, intent could often be inferred, even without full decryption. This had worked before. It worked against weaker systems. It even worked, at times, against Enigma-protected Allied traffic when procedural errors crept in. But the American traffic resisted all interpretation. SIGABA-protected messages produced no usable metadata beyond timing and volume. Analysts could not distinguish between routine logistics and high-level strategic directives. There were no recognizable headers, no repeated phrases, no crib opportunities. Even the most basic questions remained unanswered. Was this build-up for a landing in France, a diversion toward Norway, a renewed push in Italy?
German intelligence could not tell. By the spring of 1944, senior officers within the OKW, the German High Command, were receiving increasingly cautious intelligence briefings. Reports noted heavy American communications activity, but emphasized the inability to assess content or direction. This was an uncomfortable admission in a command culture that prized certainty. Meanwhile, on the Allied side, SIGABA was working exactly as intended. American planners were coordinating with British counterparts at an unprecedented level of detail. Troop movements, supply schedules, deception plans, and contingency orders flowed across SIGABA circuits. Messages traveled quickly, securely, and without compromise. There was no urgency to shorten transmissions, no fear of interception, no need to obscure meaning through delay or indirection. SIGABA allowed clarity, and clarity enabled precision. As Operation Overlord took shape, this mattered immensely. The invasion of Normandy required coordination on a scale never attempted before. Hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of ships, aircraft from multiple nations, all synchronized to tides, weather, and enemy disposition. Every delay risked exposure, every leak risked catastrophe. German intelligence intercepted pieces of this storm as it formed, but never its shape. By May 1944, frustration within German cryptanalytic units was giving way to resignation. Analysts attempted every known method. They examined long-range statistics. They tested hypothetical rotor configurations. They compared traffic patterns across theaters. Nothing worked. Some officers began to suspect that the Americans had solved the problem that Germans believed unsolvable, that they had built a cipher system without the structural weaknesses cryptanalysis depended on. This was not a comforting thought, because it meant that Germany was facing an enemy who could plan freely, while Germany itself was increasingly transparent to Allied intelligence. And when Allied forces finally moved, German commanders would be reacting, not anticipating. The realization did not come in a single moment. It emerged slowly through repeated failure, through reports that said less and less because there was less and less to say. By the eve of the Allied landings in Western Europe, the truth was becoming unavoidable. The Americans were speaking. Germany was listening, but nothing was being heard. What followed would confirm beyond doubt that this silence was not temporary, and that its consequences would be irreversible.
June 1944 did not bring revelation to German intelligence. It brought confirmation. As Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy on June 6th, the scale of the operation stunned German commanders, but it did not surprise them in the way surprise usually arrives. There was no intercepted message that had been misunderstood, no decrypted order that had been ignored. There was simply absence, a void where foreknowledge should have been. German signals intelligence had heard the buildup. They had logged the transmissions. They had measured the surge in traffic, but they had never seen the plan. In the days following the landings, intercepted American communications intensified. Orders flowed rapidly between beachheads, rear headquarters, and Washington. Adjustments were made in real time. Reinforcements were redirected. Logistical priorities shifted hour by hour. All of it traveled through SIGABA. German cryptanalysts continued their work even as Allied forces pushed inland, but by now the tone of internal assessments had changed. Where earlier reports expressed cautious optimism or deferred judgment, later documents reflected something closer to professional defeat. SIGABA was no longer treated as a problem to be solved. It was treated as a condition to be endured. Captured German intelligence summaries from late 1944 described American high-grade cipher traffic as unassailable with current methods. This phrasing mattered. It acknowledged not just failure, but limitation. The Reich no longer believed that time or effort alone would yield results. The intelligence war had tilted decisively.
While German communications continued to leak through Enigma, through Lorenz, through procedural error, American strategic traffic remained secure. Allied commanders could plan offensives, knowing that Germany would learn of them only when tanks appeared on the horizon. This asymmetry shaped the final year of the war. In the Ardennes, German planners attempted surprise during the winter offensive of December 1944. They succeeded briefly, but Allied recovery was swift. American communications, protected by SIGABA, allowed rapid coordination under pressure. Units regrouped, air support was summoned as weather cleared. The offensive stalled. Again, German intelligence listened and understood nothing. By early 1945, SIGABA had become an accepted reality within German signals units. Analysts focused instead on tactical traffic, low-level communications, and non-American targets. The highest level of American intent remained inaccessible. This had consequences beyond the battlefield. Strategic bombing campaigns, supply priorities, and post-war planning discussions all moved through secure channels. Germany faced not just an enemy advancing on all fronts, but one whose mind was hidden. When the war ended in May 1945, Allied forces captured vast quantities of German intelligence records. Among them were assessments of enemy cipher systems. Enigma had been defended until the end. Other systems were acknowledged as compromised. SIGABA stood alone. There was no record of a successful break, no decrypted archive, no moment of belated understanding. German officers reviewing the war in captivity would later remark on the mystery of American communications, how so much had been heard and so little known. In a conflict defined by information, that silence had spoken louder than any intercepted message, and as the guns fell quiet across Europe, the full weight of what SIGABA had accomplished without ever revealing itself began to settle in. Because the end of the war did not end the story of SIGABA, it marked its legacy.
When the war ended, the reckoning began, not just on the battlefield, but in archives, interrogation rooms, and intelligence assessments. The Allied victory was dissected piece by piece, tactics were analyzed, technologies were cataloged, and the invisible war of cryptography was finally examined in full. For German intelligence officers taken into custody, the revelations were sobering. They learned that Enigma, the system they had trusted implicitly, had been read for much of the war, that Allied forces had often known German intentions in advance, that entire campaigns had unfolded under the shadow of compromised secrecy. But when the discussion turned to American communications, the tone changed. There was no corresponding revelation, no hidden archive of decrypted messages, no explanation for missed opportunities beyond the truth German cryptanalysts already suspected. They had never broken SIGABA. Post-war evaluations conducted by Allied intelligence confirmed what wartime experience had suggested. SIGABA, also known as ECM Mark II, had remained secure throughout the conflict. No enemy power had succeeded in exploiting its structure. No meaningful cryptanalytic progress had been achieved against it. This was extraordinary. In a war where nearly every cipher system suffered compromise at some point, SIGABA stood as a rare exception. It had not been made famous, it had not been captured in propaganda. It had done its work quietly, faithfully, and without recognition. The immediate military implications were clear. American commanders had enjoyed a level of operational security unmatched by most other forces. Strategic coordination between theaters had been protected. High-level planning discussions had remained internal. Decisions involving timing, force allocation, and intent had reached the front lines without interference. This advantage did not guarantee victory, but it removed a critical vulnerability. Allied intelligence officers reviewing German records noted the contrast. German analysts had often been able to infer Allied intent through traffic analysis, even when content was unreadable. With SIGABA, even that was limited. The cipher's irregular output denied patterns that might have suggested meaning indirectly.
This had forced Germany to fight reactively. Without insight into American planning, German commanders relied on observation and assumption. They responded to Allied actions rather than anticipating them. In a war of maneuver and logistics, that delay was costly. The destruction wrought by the war made such details seem small at first. Cities lay in ruins, millions were dead, borders had been redrawn. But among intelligence professionals, SIGABA's success was quietly recognized as something remarkable. It represented a proof that a cipher system, properly designed and properly used, could remain secure even under the most intense scrutiny. That cryptography was not inevitably doomed by time or effort, that the balance between usability and security could be tilted decisively toward protection if one was willing to accept complexity. This realization did not fade. It would shape the next era of intelligence thinking, long after the immediate aftermath of war gave way to a new and uneasy peace. Because the story of SIGABA did not end with Germany's defeat, it extended into the very foundations of post-war cryptography and the Cold War that followed.
In the years following the war, the silence surrounding SIGABA did not break. It deepened. While Enigma became a subject of study, debate, and eventual public fascination, SIGABA remained classified. Its internal design, operational history, and cryptographic principles were not shared widely, not even among many Allied veterans. This was not oversight, it was policy. American intelligence understood what it possessed. SIGABA had demonstrated something rare, a field-proven cipher system that had resisted the full attention of one of the world's most capable cryptolytic communities. That achievement made it too valuable to expose. The machine was quietly retired from frontline service, but its philosophy lived on. As the Cold War emerged, cryptography entered a new era. Electronic computing transformed both encryption and codebreaking. Machines grew faster, algorithms more abstract, but the core lesson of SIGABA endured. Unpredictability mattered more than sheer complexity. Post-war American and NATO cryptographic systems reflected this shift. Designers focused on eliminating regularity. Control mechanisms became central. Key generation grew more sophisticated. Operator discipline was emphasized as much as technical strength. SIGABA set the standard. For former German cryptanalysts, the post-war period brought reflection. Some were interviewed, others wrote internal assessments or memoirs. They spoke of frustration, of curiosity, of professional admiration. SIGABA was often mentioned indirectly, a cipher system that defied expectations. There was no bitterness in these accounts, only acknowledgement. They had encountered a machine built by people who understood cryptanalysis at its deepest level and had designed against it, deliberately. Decades passed before SIGABA's details began to emerge publicly. When historians and cryptographers finally examined the machine in depth, the verdict was consistent. Its design was elegant in its ruthlessness. It denied the attacker everything they needed to begin. By then, the world had changed. Encryption was no longer the domain of states alone. It underpinned commerce, diplomacy, and personal communication. Yet the foundational questions remained the same ones SIGABA had answered during the war. How to communicate freely in a hostile environment, and how to do so without revealing intent. SIGABA's influence was subtle, but lasting. It did not inspire imitation in form, but in principle. Control the system. Remove predictability. Assume the enemy is always listening. In that sense, SIGABA outlived the war it served. It became part of an intellectual lineage that shaped modern cryptography, not through fame, but through example. And with that legacy established, the story returns to where it began, not to the machines or the messages, but to the meaning of silence in war. War is often measured in explosions, territory, or casualty figures. Yet some of its most decisive battles are invisible, fought not with bullets or tanks, but with knowledge or the lack of it. SIGABA exemplifies that truth. It did not fire a shot. It did not march across a battlefield. Its victory was silence, the quiet refusal of its messages to reveal themselves to the enemy. In a conflict defined by interception and insight, silence became power. The Americans could plan, coordinate, and strike with a confidence their adversaries could never match. German officers listened, measured, and waited, never knowing what was coming until it arrived. The machine had done its work with perfect discretion. But SIGABA's legacy extends beyond the tactical. It represents a philosophy of restraint and foresight, that security is not only a technical problem, but a human one. Machines alone do not protect. Discipline, procedure, and understanding are equally vital. By embedding unpredictability at the core of communication, SIGABA transformed the very way intelligence could be defended. Today, in the age of digital encryption and global networks, the principles remain the same. Unbreakable codes are not myths, they are engineered. SIGABA proved that. It showed that when skill, design, and caution converge, secrecy can be absolute, even against the most determined adversaries. The story of SIGABA is, ultimately, the story of invisible influence, a quiet machine shaping the course of events, unseen, unheard, yet decisive. It reminds us that history is shaped not only by what is done, but by what is kept hidden, and that sometimes the most extraordinary victories are won in silence.